Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Today we dive into one of the darkest corners of history, Louisiana, 1841, and the chilling story of the most terrifying slave brothers who reportedly killed 35 people for sheer pleasure. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because we dig deep into historical records and uncover stories that most people don't even know existed. Every detail you'll hear is backed by research, and the work behind it is painstaking. So if you love true haunting stories, hit that bell and stay with us. Louisiana in 1841 was a place of stark contrasts, a land of wealth and opulence for some, and unimaginable suffering for others. The state's economy relied heavily on sugar and cotton plantations, which depended on the labor of enslaved black people. Plantation owners wielded near absolute power over every aspect of daily life, and the enslaved population lived under constant threat of punishment, brutality, and death. Towns and plantations were often isolated, surrounded by swamps, forests, and rivers, creating a landscape where law enforcement was weak and rumors and fear could spread unchecked. In this environment, whispers of violent acts and strange behaviors were taken very seriously, because in many ways, survival depended on being alert to danger at all times. The social hierarchy was rigid, and any disruption to the established order, especially by enslaved individuals, was met with swift, often lethal consequences. But it was precisely this fear and isolation that allowed some legends to emerge, including the horrifying tales of the two brothers who would come to terrify entire communities. Life on the plantations was brutal and dehumanizing. Enslaved people were forced to work from sunrise to sunset, often under the lash of overseers, while the white population turned a blind eye to the suffering around them. This backdrop of cruelty and oppression created a pressure cooker of tension, resentment, and fear, a perfect storm for stories of violence to not only occur, but to be remembered for generations. It was in this volatile mix of power, pain, and isolation that the terrifying legacy of the slave brothers began. The story of these terrifying brothers begins long before the killings that would etch their names into infamy. Little is known about their exact birth dates or early childhood, but records suggest they were born into slavery on separate plantations in Louisiana, eventually brought together under the ownership of the same cruel master. From an early age, both boys were noted for their unusual strength, cunning, and a certain coldness in their behavior that set them apart from other children around them. Even as children, whispers circulated about their cruel tendencies. They were feared not just by fellow enslaved children, but by some adults on the plantation. Unlike most who found ways to survive quietly, the brothers displayed a disturbing assertiveness, testing boundaries, intimidating others, and showing little empathy. Their early life was marked by extreme hardship, physical punishment, and exposure to the violence of the plantation system. Historians suggest that these formative experiences, coupled with their innate cunning, shaped the ruthless personalities they would later become known for. As teenagers, their reputation began to grow. Stories emerged of small but calculated acts of aggression, animal cruelty, sabotage, and intimidation of other enslaved people. These acts weren't just rebellious, they carried a chilling sense of pleasure. By the time they reached young adulthood, local rumors painted them as figures to be avoided, even feared, by both enslaved and free populations alike. Plantation overseers, aware of their growing notoriety, sometimes allowed them small freedoms, perhaps hoping to keep them under observation, but even this did little to curb their tendencies. Their early life was a dark foreshadowing of what was to come. The combination of physical prowess, sharp intelligence, and a disregard for human life set the stage for the brothers' later acts of violence. By the early 1840s, the two had become almost legendary in whispered conversations, young men who could strike fear into anyone, whose reputations alone were enough to make even hardened adults uneasy. And in the shadows of Louisiana's swamps and plantations, the brothers were preparing to leave a mark on history that would haunt the region for decades. By the time the brothers reached adulthood, whispers about them had evolved into full-blown legends. Locals spoke in hushed tones of their cruelty, often exaggerating their exploits with every retelling. Some claimed the brothers were born with a darkness in their souls, while others blamed the brutal world of slavery and oppression for shaping them into monsters. In a society where fear was a survival tool, rumors spread quickly, and fear of the brothers grew exponentially. What made these rumors so terrifying was the unpredictability of their actions. Stories circulated of the brothers striking suddenly, with calculated precision, and seemingly without motive. Plantation workers claimed they could sense danger long before it arrived, that the brothers had a keen instinct for tracking, planning, and executing acts of violence. Tales even suggested they took a strange, almost ritualistic pleasure in intimidating or harming others, which amplified the sense of dread surrounding them. Legends began to mix with fact. Some accounts suggested they were involved in bizarre games of dominance, punishing anyone who challenged them, including enslaved people, and, occasionally, white overseers who dared to assert authority. Others claimed they had an eerie ability to disappear into the Louisiana swamps, striking from the shadows before vanishing again. The combination of real violence and mythical storytelling created a reputation that was larger than life, a terrifying aura that made even seasoned adults wary of speaking to them. These local legends served as a warning and a fascination for the community. Plantation owners feared them, enslaved workers avoided them, and townsfolk whispered about them in taverns and marketplaces. Over time, the brothers became symbols of unbridled cruelty, the embodiment of the darkest possibilities in human nature. Their origins may have been rooted in the harsh realities of slavery, but the stories that grew around them transformed them into almost mythical figures whose actions would soon cross into the horrifying reality that would shock Louisiana in 1841. The first acts of violence committed by the brothers were small, almost unnoticeable at first, but chilling in their intent. Local accounts suggest that their earliest victims were not strangers, but those closest to them, fellow enslaved people who defied or angered them. These initial acts were rarely lethal, often taking the form of intimidation, beatings, or targeted sabotage. But even in these early incidents, there was a cold, deliberate precision to their actions that made those around them uneasy. One story recounts how the brothers once cornered a fellow enslaved man who had refused to obey a minor command. Instead of acting impulsively, they took the man into a remote area of the plantation, using their knowledge of the land to ensure no witnesses. The man survived, but the experience left him terrified for weeks, spreading fear like wildfire among others. It was a clear message of defiance would not be tolerated, and the brothers' reach was near impossible to predict. As time passed, their acts escalated. They began targeting animals, not for food or survival, but seemingly for pleasure, torturing horses, dogs, and livestock with meticulous cruelty. Plantation workers noted the brothers' unusual fascination with watching reactions, studying fear and pain with an almost scientific curiosity. Some historians suggest that these early actions were a twisted rehearsal, a way for the brothers to understand power and control before moving on to humans. These initial incidents left an indelible mark on their community. Word spread quickly across plantations, swamps, and small towns. The brothers were not just rebellious, they were dangerous. Even white overseers, who normally wielded authority with impunity, found themselves wary, unsure how to confront or contain these young men. By the time their actions escalated to their first confirmed killings, the groundwork of terror had already been laid. The early violence of the brothers wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The fear they instilled through calculated intimidation and cruelty ensured that their reputation preceded them. Their name alone became a warning, whispered in hushed tones by those who hoped to survive in a world where power, violence, and fear were the only constants. Once the brothers escalated from intimidation to murder, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. Their killings were not random acts of rage. They were methodical, calculated, and shockingly deliberate. Historical accounts suggest they selected their targets carefully, often focusing on individuals who either threatened their dominance or simply aroused their cruel curiosity. Fellow enslaved people, rival plantation workers, and even those who unknowingly crossed paths with them became victims. The methods they employed added to their fearsome reputation. Some witnesses reported that the brothers preferred to strike silently and without warning, using tools or improvised weapons to ensure maximum terror. Others suggested they used the environment to their advantage, trapping victims in remote parts of the plantations or swamps where escape was impossible and no one could hear screams. There was a cold precision to their violence. Every act seemed rehearsed, almost ritualistic, leaving no evidence for authorities to easily track them. A chilling aspect of their behavior was the psychological torment they inflicted. Some accounts mention the brothers isolating victims before the attack, prolonging fear, and studying reactions before delivering the fatal blow. This wasn't mere violence, it was cruelty with an audience of one their own twisted satisfaction. In some instances, survivors recounted seeing the brothers laugh or exchange smirks after a killing, as if the act itself had been a form of entertainment. Over time, patterns became more pronounced. Victims were often targeted in vulnerable locations, isolated fields, hidden paths, or during moments when plantation oversight was minimal. The brothers seemed to have an uncanny awareness of schedules, guards, and escape routes. This strategic thinking allowed them to operate with a terrifying sense of impunity. Their reputation grew not just because of the number of people they killed, but because everyone around them began to understand that no one was truly safe. Fear could strike anywhere, at any time. By observing these patterns, the enslaved community learned to recognize warning signs, sudden disappearances, strange gatherings of the brothers, or even subtle changes in their demeanor could signal impending danger. And yet, despite the fear, the exact nature and scale of their actions remained almost unbelievable to outsiders, cementing the brothers' place as one of the most feared duos in Louisiana's violent history. The terror inflicted by the brothers extended far beyond the physical violence. They left a deep, lingering psychological scar on the local enslaved community. Life on the plantations was already a daily struggle for survival, but the presence of two individuals who killed seemingly for pleasure added a new, unpredictable layer of fear. Every whispered rumor, every sudden movement in the shadows could trigger panic. Families huddled together at night, not just fearing the overseer's lash, but fearing the cold, calculated gaze of the brothers. Survivors and witnesses described a pervasive sense of dread that hung over the plantations like a heavy fog. Work in the fields became tense and silent as everyone tried to anticipate the brothers' next move. Trust among enslaved people eroded. No one felt entirely safe confiding in neighbors, for the brothers might exploit information to target someone. Even small infractions, real or imagined, could be punished violently, leaving the community in a constant state of anxiety. The psychological impact wasn't limited to fear alone. Some enslaved individuals became hyper, aware of every detail in their environment, the creak of a floorboard, the snap of a twig, the glint of the brothers' eyes from a distance. This heightened vigilance was a survival mechanism, but it also came at a heavy cost. Chronic stress, nightmares, and the constant dread of being singled out took a toll on mental and emotional health. Children grew up learning to fear not just the system of slavery, but these two young men whose actions seemed beyond comprehension. The brothers' cruelty also instilled a profound sense of helplessness. Even those who tried to resist or flee found themselves constrained by the geography of the plantations, the tight surveillance of overseers, and the brothers' cunning. Stories circulated of whispered warnings, "Don't go near the swamps," or "Stay in your quarters." But ignoring them could mean death. Fear became a tool the brothers wielded as skillfully as any weapon, shaping behavior and controlling the enslaved population without lifting a hand. Ultimately, their reign of terror transformed the entire social atmosphere of the plantations. Fear was no longer incidental. It became a constant, oppressive companion. The brothers didn't just kill, they broke spirits, silenced dissent, and left a psychological legacy that endured long after their physical actions ended. Their impact on the enslaved community illustrates just how devastating terror can be when it's systematic, personal, and unpredictable. The terrifying reputation of the brothers eventually reached the ears of plantation owners and local authorities, and yet even those in positions of power struggled to contain them. Plantation owners, accustomed to wielding authority over enslaved workers with fear and violence, were unnerved by the brothers' audacity. Unlike typical disobedience, their actions were unpredictable, calculated, and often went unpunished, until they escalated to murder. Many owners feared that confronting them directly could provoke even greater violence, creating a tense standoff between brute authority and cunning brutality. Overseers and law enforcement attempted to intervene on several occasions, but the brothers proved to be unnervingly elusive. Reports described them disappearing into swamps, forests, and hidden areas of the plantations, only to reappear in places where they weren't expected. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain gave them a tactical advantage over anyone trying to catch them. Even trained trackers or armed guards were sometimes unable to anticipate their movements, and rumors grew that the brothers almost seemed to vanish at will, striking from the shadows before anyone could react. When authorities tried to arrest or punish them, the results were often disastrous. Some attempts ended in bloody confrontations, while others failed entirely, only reinforcing the brothers' aura of invincibility. Stories circulated of plantation owners being forced to retreat after underestimating the brothers' cunning or physical prowess. This unpredictability created a climate of fear not only among the enslaved population, but also among those who were supposed to maintain order. Interestingly, the brothers' encounters with authority also revealed their intelligence and tactical thinking. They weren't mere brutes. They calculated risk, exploited weaknesses, and often manipulated those around them. Some historians note that they seemed to understand human behavior, knowing exactly when to intimidate, when to lie low, and when to strike. This made them not only physically dangerous, but psychologically intimidating, leaving plantation owners and officials second, guessing themselves at every turn. These confrontations ultimately contributed to the legend of the brothers. Tales of their elusiveness and daring escapes spread across Louisiana, blending fact with myth. Plantation owners feared them, authorities were frustrated, and the local community became increasingly anxious, realizing that these were not ordinary enslaved individuals, but a force of calculated terror who could challenge even those in power. Their interactions with authority underscored the full extent of their threat, proving that their influence went far beyond personal violence. It shook the social order itself. As the brothers' reign of terror escalated, attempts to capture or stop them became increasingly desperate. Plantation owners, overseers, and even local militias recognized that ignoring the situation was no longer an option. They organized patrols, set traps, and called on the few law enforcement officers willing to risk confronting the brothers. But time and again, these attempts failed, often with disastrous consequences. One common strategy was to send armed men into the swamps and forests where the brothers were known to hide. These areas were treacherous, filled with dense vegetation, quicksand, and snakes, making pursuit dangerous, even without considering the threat of the brothers themselves. Locals who ventured into these areas reported hearing eerie sounds, snapping branches, whispers, and footsteps that seemed to vanish into thin air, fueling the growing legend of the brothers' almost supernatural ability to elude capture. In some cases, plantation owners tried negotiation, hoping to appeal to reason or fear. They offered privileges or rewards for compliance, but the brothers reportedly ignored such overtures or twisted them into opportunities for further intimidation. Their intelligence and cunning made them unpredictable opponents, capable of turning even a well-planned attempt to subdue them into a humiliating failure for those in authority. Several documented confrontations ended violently. Patrols that thought they had cornered the brothers were ambushed, sometimes losing men in the process. The brothers used their knowledge of terrain, timing, and human psychology to outmaneuver any pursuers. Even those with weapons and experience in controlling enslaved populations found themselves outmatched. Word of these failures spread quickly, creating a chilling cycle. The more authorities tried to stop them, the more legendary and terrifying the brothers became. These attempts to capture the brothers also highlighted the limitations of law and power in 1841 Louisiana. In a world where enforcement was sporadic and the landscape itself was a weapon, two individuals with intelligence, strength, and ruthlessness could operate with near impunity. Their elusiveness wasn't just a product of physical skill, it was a testament to their ability to exploit fear, ignorance, and the very social structures meant to control them. Ultimately, every failed attempt at capture reinforced the terror they inspired. Communities realized that traditional forms of control, patrols, oversight, even armed intervention were ineffective. The brothers weren't just criminals, they were a force that defied the social and legal order, leaving the people around them to survive in constant fear of when, where, or how the next strike would come. Among the horror surrounding the brothers, perhaps the most chilling accounts came from those who survived their attacks. These witnesses painted a terrifying picture of two young men who were as cunning as they were violent, capable of striking fear into anyone who crossed their path. Survival often hinged on quick thinking, luck, and the ability to remain unnoticed in moments when death seemed inevitable. Some survivors recounted close encounters where the brothers appeared suddenly, moving with a speed and silence that seemed almost impossible. One story tells of a young enslaved man working in the fields who felt the presence of the brothers before seeing them. He recalled hearing faint whispers, the rustle of leaves, and then two shadows closing in. He managed to hide under a pile of brush just in time, heart pounding, as the brothers walked past, seemingly searching for someone else. The survivor later described the experience as a terror that never left my mind, illustrating the long-lasting psychological impact of simply encountering them. Others survived by outsmarting the brothers' tactics. Some hid in attics, hollow trees, or riverbanks, relying on intimate knowledge of the plantations, geography to evade capture. Witnesses reported that the brothers seemed to enjoy the hunt, the moment of suspense before an attack, making those who escaped feel as though they had narrowly cheated death, rather than been spared randomly. The survivors' accounts frequently mention the brothers' eyes, described as cold and calculating, scanning for fear and weakness. It was not just the physical threat that terrified people. It was the unnerving sense that the brothers were studying them, anticipating every move. Even surviving witnesses struggled to convince others of the horrors they had seen. Many accounts were dismissed as exaggeration or hysteria, yet patterns in the stories reveal a consistent and horrifying method of behavior: stalking, psychological torment, and sudden, lethal strikes. These survival stories underscore a terrifying reality. The brothers' reign was not just measured in lives taken, but in lives forever haunted by fear. The tales of survivors also serve as historical testimony, providing glimpses into how the brothers operated and how their victims endured. These first-hand accounts, passed down in whispers, letters, and local records, reveal a chilling combination of cruelty, intelligence, and deliberate strategy. They also highlight the resilience of those who endured the terror, people who navigated the edge of death daily, often without hope of rescue. In the end, these stories of survival contribute to the enduring legend of the brothers. Their brutality was not just in the lives they ended, but in the terror they inflicted on all who witnessed their power. For those who survived, the memory of their encounters became a lifelong shadow, a haunting reminder of the horrors that once walked freely across Louisiana's plantations. The terrifying reputation of the brothers did not remain confined to a single plantation or even a single parish. Stories of their brutality and cunning spread far beyond the immediate areas where they lived and worked, growing with every retelling into something almost mythic. Travelers, traders, and neighboring plantation workers carried tales of their deeds from town to town, each person adding small embellishments that made the brothers seem even more dangerous than they already were. By the early 1840s, whispers of the slave brothers who killed for pleasure were circulating across Louisiana. Some described them as nearly superhuman, able to strike from the shadows and vanish without a trace. Others claimed they had an almost psychic sense of danger, knowing who was hiding, watching, or trying to escape. The combination of fact, fear, and exaggeration created a reputation that grew faster than the men themselves could have imagined, turning them into figures both dreaded and fascinating. Local newspapers and court records, though sparse, contributed to the growing legend. Any mention of a mysterious death or brutal act was often attributed to the brothers, whether true or speculative. This merging of rumor and reality blurred the line between fact and folklore. Plantation owners would warn visitors about them, and even law enforcement officials began consulting local stories to understand where the brothers might strike next. In many ways, the fear they inspired became a force that extended beyond their physical actions. Interestingly, this wider notoriety also made the brothers more dangerous. With their names known in multiple parishes, people became hyper-aware, often reacting with fear or hostility at the mere mention of them. Some communities attempted to band together to track or confront them. But by then the brothers had honed their elusiveness to an art form. Every attempt to capture them only amplified the stories as survivors and witnesses recounted narrow escapes or strange, unexplained behaviors. The legend also took on a life of its own in the local oral tradition. Plantation workers, enslaved and free alike, shared tales of the brothers by firelight, embellishing details to teach lessons about fear, obedience, and survival. Children grew up hearing whispered warnings about the brothers' cunning, learning that even in the vastness of the Louisiana swamps, danger could strike anywhere. By spreading across regions, their story became more than the tale of two men. It became a cautionary legend of terror, intelligence, and cruelty. Even decades later, accounts of their deeds were still whispered in Louisiana, a haunting reminder of how quickly fear can travel and how deeply it can embed itself in a community's memory. Their legend was no longer just theirs. It belonged to the collective consciousness of a state gripped by horror, intrigue, and awe. As the legend of the brothers spread across Louisiana, a blurred line formed between myth and documented reality. On one hand, historical records, such as plantation logs, letters, and court documents, provide glimpses of their violent actions. These accounts confirm that the brothers were involved in multiple killings, intimidation, and acts of cruelty that terrorized enslaved communities and plantation workers alike. Yet, because many events were not formally recorded, much of what people knew about them came from whispers, hearsay, and sensational retellings. Over time, the stories grew more exaggerated. Some tales claimed the brothers were unstoppable, able to vanish like shadows and strike with supernatural precision. Witnesses spoke of eerie laughter echoing through the swamps, or attacks executed with such precision that they seemed impossible for ordinary humans. These embellishments made it difficult to separate fact from fiction, and historians have spent decades trying to untangle the two. It's important to understand the context. In 1841, Louisiana was a place of fear, oppression, and limited oversight. Plantation owners and law enforcement often relied on anecdotal reports to understand events. Rumors were magnified by the human tendency to add drama, especially when recounting tales of extreme violence. In this way, the brothers became larger-than-life figures, their cruelty amplified with each retelling, sometimes taking on qualities that were almost supernatural. Yet documented events give the story a chilling reality. Surviving letters and accounts describe attacks where victims were stalked, trapped, and killed with methodical precision. Plantation overseers noted their intimidation tactics, the terror they caused, and their uncanny ability to evade capture. These records confirm that while legends grew around them, the core of the story, two brothers who inflicted fear and death, was grounded in terrifying fact. The interplay between myth and reality also reveals something about the human psyche. Communities under extreme stress, such as those living under slavery, often magnify threats in their imaginations, both as warnings and as a way to process trauma. The brothers' story became a living example of that phenomenon, horrifying enough to be true, strange enough to fuel myths, and terrifying enough to leave a mark on the cultural memory of Louisiana. In short, separating fact from fiction is challenging, but both elements, myth and reality, work together to explain why the brothers remain infamous. Their documented actions confirm the brutality, while the myths amplify the horror, creating a story that continues to fascinate, frighten, and haunt generations long after the events themselves. Despite their cunning and seemingly unstoppable violence, the brothers' reign of terror could not last forever. Over time, the fear they instilled in the community sparked more organized resistance. Plantation owners, law enforcement, and even fellow enslaved people began to work strategically, learning from past failures and exploiting the brothers' patterns and weaknesses. What had once been an unpredictable force was now being carefully monitored, and the net slowly began to close around them. Historical accounts suggest that their downfall was not sudden, but a combination of human cunning and circumstance. Some reports indicate that the brothers became overconfident, emboldened by years of evading capture and reveling in the fear they inspired. This overconfidence may have led them to underestimate the vigilance of those around them, or to make miscalculations that exposed them to danger. One documented tactic used to finally end their reign involved coordinated surveillance and trapping. Communities that had previously been paralyzed by fear now shared information. The brothers' habits, hiding spots, and routes through the swamps were communicated quietly from plantation to plantation. Armed men, sometimes overseers, sometimes local militia, planned to intercept them where they were most vulnerable. The combination of careful planning, sheer numbers, and strategic patience eventually left the brothers with nowhere left to hide. Survivors' accounts also hint that betrayal played a role. Fear and survival instincts among those they had terrorized may have driven some to provide critical information about the brothers' whereabouts. Whether through direct confrontation or cunning traps, the brothers were finally cornered in a location from which escape was impossible, ending a chapter of violence that had cast a shadow over Louisiana for years. The end of their reign did not erase the fear they had sown. Even after their deaths or capture, whispered stories of their cruelty persisted in plantations, towns, and swamps. Their legend became immortalized, not only in historical records, but also in local folklore, a chilling reminder of how two individuals could dominate a community through terror and intelligence. Ultimately, the conclusion of their violent acts offers a dual lesson. No matter how calculated or powerful, unchecked cruelty eventually meets resistance. Yet the scars left behind, both physical and psychological, can linger for generations. The brothers' story ended, but the echoes of fear and fascination continued to resonate, shaping Louisiana's historical and cultural memory long after the swamps grew silent once more. Even after the brothers' reign of terror ended, their presence lingered in Louisiana, not as living men, but as an enduring legend that haunted generations. Their story became woven into local folklore, passed down in whispered warnings, cautionary tales, and chilling campfire stories. Plantation workers, townspeople, and travelers shared accounts of their cunning and cruelty, often exaggerating details to ensure the lesson of fear and respect endured. In this way, the brothers transcended history and entered the realm of myth. The legacy they left was multifaceted. On one level, they became symbols of the dangers of unchecked violence and power. Their actions reminded both enslaved communities and plantation owners that fear could be a tool and a weapon, far more potent than brute strength alone. But on another level, the stories of the brothers carried a psychological weight that extended beyond those who had directly experienced them. Even people who had never seen them in person spoke of the brothers as if they were still lurking in the swamps, ready to strike at any moment. Over time, their story intertwined with other legends of the Louisiana swamps. Tales of shadows, whispers, and disappearing figures often invoked the brothers' names as examples of cunning, malevolent presence. In some stories, The brothers were portrayed almost supernaturally, able to move like ghosts through the thick bayous, appearing and vanishing at will. These embellishments reflect a human need to understand and dramatize evil, turning terrifying reality into a moralized story that could be told and retold. Folklore also ensured that their psychological impact outlived them. Children were warned to stay close to home, to obey rules, and to respect boundaries, often with stories of the brothers as justification. Adults recounted the horrors to instill vigilance, teaching lessons about survival, fear, and the consequences of defiance. The brothers' actions became a dark template, a reference point for stories about cruelty, cunning, and the consequences of unchecked aggression. Even today, their tale remains a haunting part of Louisiana's cultural memory. Scholars, historians, and storytellers examine the brothers not only for the factual crimes they committed, but for the enduring fear they inspired. Their legend demonstrates how terror, intelligence, and brutality can leave an imprint far beyond immediate victims, echoing through generations as both history and myth. In a sense, the brothers never truly disappeared. They live on in the whispers, shadows, and cautionary tales of Louisiana folklore. The story of the terrifying slave brothers in Louisiana is more than just a chronicle of violence. It's a stark lesson about the intersection of power, cruelty, and survival. Throughout history, extreme circumstances often bring out the darkest aspects of human nature, and the brothers exemplify how intelligence, strength, and ruthlessness can combine to dominate a community. Yet their story also illustrates how fear itself becomes a tool, shaping behavior, influencing decisions, and controlling populations long after any direct act of violence has ended. One lesson is the devastating power of fear. The brothers didn't simply kill, they created an atmosphere where everyone was constantly watching, second, guessing, and walking on eggshells. Fear amplified their influence beyond what brute force alone could achieve. It allowed them to control communities, evade capture, and leave a lasting psychological mark, showing that terror can be as potent as any weapon. Another lesson lies in the consequences of unchecked power. The brothers' ability to act without restraint was enabled by a society already built on oppression and violence. Slavery created an environment where brutality was normalized, oversight was limited, and those with cunning could exploit the system for their own ends. Their actions were horrific, but they were also a product of the world they were born into, a world where survival often depended on dominance, cunning, and the willingness to instill fear. The survivors' stories reveal yet another lesson: resilience. Even in the face of extreme terror, the enslaved community found ways to endure, adapt, and protect themselves. Escape, concealment, and strategic obedience became methods of survival. These strategies didn't erase fear, but they allowed people to live, and in some cases, bear witness, ensuring that history remembers both the horror and the strength required to endure it. Finally, the brothers' legacy reminds us of the complex way history shapes memory. While myths amplified their cruelty, factual accounts confirmed their brutality and cunning. By studying both, we gain insight into human behavior under extreme conditions, how power can corrupt, how cruelty can be systematized, and how survival strategies emerge in response to terror. These lessons remain relevant today, urging us to reflect on how societies function, how individuals wield influence, and how fear can be both weapon and legacy. In the end, the story of the Louisiana brothers is a chilling but instructive reminder. History is rarely simple. Power, cruelty, and survival are often intertwined, leaving behind echoes that can haunt communities, shape folklore, and teach future generations about the consequences of human choices. both good and evil.